Well, welcome everybody to episode 127 of the Typewriter video series. This is Joe, and I was inspired this week by reading Richard Polt's blog, and his blog article dated August 12th, 2018. Book review, Border Districts by Gerald Murnane. I really loved Richard's review of this book, and I was intrigued by the book, and I followed the leads that Richard left, the several blog articles by Robert Messinger of Australia writing about Gerald Murnane, and also this New York Times Magazine article dated March 27, 2018, titled, "Is the next Nobel laureate in literature tending bar in a dusty Australian town?" And that was written by Mark Benelli. So that's a really provocative title, and it was, of course, it sucked me in, and I enjoyed reading that article. And I was really interested in the details of this particular author. He's from Gourock, Australia, or that's where he lives right now. It's about a 5-hour car drive from Melbourne. He plays golf about once a week. He's age 79. And he writes, probably not as prolifically now as he used to. He claims he's in semi-retirement right now. But there is this quote from this magazine article that I wanted to read to you. And in it, Mr. Murnane says, quote, "In 1979, I taught myself to type using the index finger of my right hand alone. Since then, I have composed all of my fiction and other writings using the finger just mentioned, and one or another of my 3 manual typewriters." Unquote. And in a corresponding video that is linked to that article, you can see Mr. Murnane actually in action, typing one-handed, and it's kind of like what I demonstrated at the start of this video. He's using the index finger of his right hand, as he indicates, to type, and he rests his left hand, his left finger is on the shift key, so he's kind of shifting with the left, typing with the right. I had to try that. I sat down a day or two ago, and I actually tried to sit down and write with it, and at first it was slightly awkward, I must admit, but then as I stuck with it, I could see the benefit of it, because at least for me, being right-handed, that's my dominant hand, and the index finger is pretty much the strongest finger of your hand, so there's a lot of force, especially for a machine like, for instance, this Brother-made Webster. Some of these machines require a little bit more force to get a good imprint on, and I can see that would be a good technique for using on a machine like one of these. It's not quite as easy to touch type on. There were some other details of Mr. Murnane's life that I thought were real fascinating. For instance, he lives currently in an outbuilding behind his son's house, and it's kind of like a one-room cottage, if you will, and the majority of that space is taken up with filing cabinets that has a chronological archives of all of his writings, including all of his letters, etc., which I think is really cool. The guy is highly organized. I wish I was that organized. It does take room, however, obviously, but he kind of lives alone in that environment, and it's kind of inspiring to see somebody that organized where he can pull out all of his work in chronological order, all the research, all the notes of every book and article and story he's written. And one of the things also that I was fascinated with is years ago, when he was living in another situation, a more crowded situation, he found the only place that he could easily set up his typewriter and write with was on the ironing board in his kitchen and using his one-fingered typing technique. I thought that was fascinating. You know, we always complain, us dabblers in writing, we tend to complain about, well, we don't have the optimal setup, and maybe we need this gadget or that gadget or this piece of software or that piece of software, or maybe I need a nicer typewriter or whatever. But man, that guy found the necessity of simply finding a place to write and sitting down and writing using an ironing board, if that's what it took. Very inspiring. So it turns out, reading Robert Messinger's blog articles about Mr. Murnane, it turns out that he has, as of, according to Robert's article, a Nakajima all portable, a 1960s Remington Monarch, and an Adler Standard. And he kind of rotates through those machines, apparently. And in the video interviews I saw, he claims he keeps more than one manual typewriter, principally because of the possibility one might break. He'll have a backup, which is a good strategy. That's always how I justify my collection, right? So all of this is preparatory to me asking you 3 questions. And that's what I kind of want to discuss with you today. There's 3 questions. First question is, what is your preferred typing method? Is it one-fingered, like Mr. Murnane, with maybe using the other hand as a shift for shifting and maybe carriage returning? Is it the two-fingered, classic two-fingered typing technique, or is it maybe 4 fingers, 2 fingers of each hand? Are you a full touch typist? I'd like to know. I'd like you to leave your comments down below and tell me. Myself, what I found for manual typewriters works best for me, because I was never trained at a young age as a manual typist. I learned typewriting on electric machines in high school. But I found for typewriters like these, the portables that aren't quite so easy to type on, what works for me is my right hand is stronger than my left. And so I can pretty much touch type with maybe the 3 stronger fingers for sure. And by kind of rotating my hand, I can get to the ring finger and pinky finger good enough to make a decent imprint. So my right hand, I'm kind of pseudo touch typing, but my left hand is weaker than my right. And so with my left hand, I'm doing more of a 1 or 2 fingered typing. So I call it weird typing. I've talked about this before, maybe mentioned it in my blog, but I kind of do a combination, 1 or 2 fingers on the left hand, more of the fingers on my right hand, and it seems to work for me. I get a consistent imprint. But I still also will switch to just 2 finger typing like that, and I'm pretty quick at it. The thing about it I find is, for me, it's not just about the speed, but it's more about the quality of imprint. In fact, that's the biggest limitation I find with manual typewriters, or the biggest problem, is really getting an adequate imprint. Dark, even impression, so the letters aren't barely there. If you underhit the keys on some machines, the spacing might not work properly on the carriage, etc., etc. So there's a lot of reasons to favor a firm impression over the speed of typing. It depends on what you're doing with it, of course, but that's one of the main reasons that I do it. But I'd like to hear your reasons. What is your preferred typing method? That's the first question. Okay, the second question is, why is it your preferred typing method? And I can think of a number of different reasons. I've already told you mainly the reasons why I kind of do either the 2-fingered or the weird typing method. The reason for me why I got into the weird typing method is I started noticing, it was a few years ago, and I was troubleshooting this intermittent problem on a Smith Corona Silent Super, the really filthy, grungy one that I had recently gotten. And I was filling page after page with single-space test typings, and I was noticing that I was getting this periodically. The letter A was being mishit, like the letter A would be lower than the other letters, or barely struck and very faint. And at first I thought it was a mechanical problem with the typewriter. And I started looking at the linkages, and they were nice and even and everything. And then I started thinking a little bit more about it, and I realized what was going on here is I'm dominantly right-handed. But the letter A is the 3rd most frequent letter in the English language. But it's typed with the weakest finger on my weakest hand. Okay, so it's a confluence of 3 influences. The 3rd most frequent letter typed with the weakest finger of the weakest hand, and I ended up just mishitting the letter too much. And that's one of the reasons why I switched over to the weird typing method. You'll find on the standard QWERTY keyboard you have A, S, D, and E. They're all very common letters in English, but they're all on the left hand, which if you're right hand dominant, that's your weaker hand. So you find yourself typing more frequently used letters on the weaker hand. hence the reason why I switched over to this other method. Okay, that's my reason, but your reasons for why you have your preferred typing method might be different. I'm sure they're different. It could be comfort. Maybe you have some neuroskeletal problems in your wrist or fingers. Maybe it's just more comfortable for you to do that. Maybe it was the tradition that you were trained at in school. Maybe you went to a more formal typing education and you really learned how to manually type, touch typing on a manual typewriter. That could be a great reason. Or maybe your reason is, it just works for me. That's what I do. I don't really have a good reason. Whatever. I'd like to know, what is your preferred typing method? Why? And now the third question is, do you need to touch type in order to be a writer? Do you need to touch type? And this is a loaded question, obviously, because we get back to the whole issue with Mr. Gerald Murnane in Australia. He has been a successful author, and he is considered a candidate, perhaps, for the next Nobel laureate in literature, and he types with one finger. So, do you need to touch type to be a writer? Well, it's a loaded question, and my loaded answer is that there is a difference in usage mode between being a, for instance, secretary in the day of the typewriter, back in the era of the typewriter. To be a secretary, you had to be able to type rapidly and accurately. But that's not necessarily the skill set required to write as a writer. A lot of writers do their first drafts by hand, or they typewrite it, and then that is then edited by hand and then retyped, etc., etc. I've always said this, and I'll say it again, but I think the speed of thought up here as a writer, that is the limiting factor. That's the bottleneck in the works. It's not the mechanics of putting letters down on paper that is the limiting factor. It's always been, how fast can you think? How well can you craft your words and your sentences together? And generally, that's really limited speed-wise. The thoughts up here is what governs the whole speed of it. So I don't think very many of us can sit down and write a finished chapter in a book from scratch, nonstop, word processing it maybe. I don't think many of us can do that. I think writing is a craft, and it involves a lot of hard work, and most of writing is editing and revision, I firmly believe. So I think there's two phases of writing, therefore. I think there is the initial creative outpouring, the rough drafting, if you will, the raw ideas, the raw words, getting them down on paper. And during that phase, I don't really think the speed of data entry is really important. I really think it's all about non-distractive writing, being able to free your thoughts and let the words flow. But on the other hand, the back-end process of writing, I think, becomes more about editing. And that's where you want to use a word processor, obviously, and finish it up that way so you can move those words and paragraphs around. But I think Mr. Murnane really has it nailed here. You don't need to have the speed of a touch typist to be a writer or to be using typewriters as a writer. So those are the three questions. I'd like you guys to leave your responses down below in the comments section. I'm really curious as to how you guys work. What are your working methodologies? And this whole thing about writers and their methodologies is really fascinating to me, especially writers who do use typewriters, because you'll find that there isn't one right way of doing things, and that's always the case with these mechanical marvels. It's just amazing, though, what you find. You find somebody discovers a new thing that works for them, and you try it out, and you might say, hey, you know what? That's actually pretty cool. I might learn from that. So we kind of have to learn from each other. So leave your comments below. Tell us, share with us your answers to those three questions. What's your preferred typing method? Why is it your preferred typing method? And do you need to touch type to be a writer or to be successful at writing? Okay, that's it for episode 127 of the Typewriter video series. Stay creative, guys. Leave your comments below, and until next time, you have yourselves a great day.